Hi, I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead, and welcome to episode 145, Does Your Literature Review Connect to Your Project? I got the idea for this episode after working with a client this week who was struggling with writing a literature review chapter. And one of the struggles with this chapter was that there is certainly a lot of decision making that goes into deciding what sources to include, what sources not to include. And even though many of us now are not really writing a literature review where we have a chapter anymore, so we're not PhD students, we don't really have a set literature review chapter, many of us are still working through literature review sections in articles or background sections or even white papers or grant reports where we might have this information. And the question really still applies. And so what we came down to that I think started the question for this episode was this idea of making sure that your literature review connects to your project in some way. And certainly we can think of that as a big, broad connection. So, is the general discussion about the general discussion of your particular project? But I think breaking that down into a couple more concrete steps could be really helpful here. So I'm going to share on the screen a source that I often share with my graduate students. It's a website out of Niagara University. It's got all kinds of things on here about literature reviews. But I just want to share the most relevant things to this discussion today. And so one of the things that has to happen when you write a literature review chapter versus a small section in a paper is that you might have the impetus to include more things rather than less because you've got more scope generally. These chapters I've seen range anywhere from between 15 pages and 50 pages. So that's a lot of room where you could put in all kinds of sources that are tangentially related. And so why I like this particular website, and I will put a link to it in the show notes, is that it basically says, what are you supposed to be doing here? So one of the things you're supposed to be doing is you investigating sources that are related to your topic. And the key word here is related to the topic. So one of the ways that I advise this particular student to kind of think through the literature review and to decide are all the sources that are worked through in here necessary is to do a very high level read and take these 3 steps. And so the first step would be looking through, and this could also work for a section of an article, by the way, you could do it in a much shorter way, but to go through and highlight everything in green, like green is go, it's good. Highlight everything in green that absolutely has to go in the article or the chapter. So whatever those sources are, it could be a landmark study that everybody cites. It could be a study that maybe is a precursor to the one that you're doing. It could be a study that maybe has a similar methodology that you want to reference. And maybe, for the record, maybe that discussion is more in your methodology area. But the idea is to just quickly highlight everything that 100%, no question, has to go in your literature review. So highlight those in green. And another way then to look, a second level look, would be to look through and ask yourself about everything remaining. Is this definitely connected to my project? And if so, how so? And one of the things that we found when we were working through her project was that a lot of the threads were very tangential. So for example, this particular student was working on a computer science project, and they were working on something for computer science, how computer science pedagogy is taught in the high schools. And so, certainly a couple of the sources were about that. They were about some of the methods, like, definite studies about how teaching computer science content to high school students in these ways is successful and things like that. So, we knew some of those sources or studies needed to stay in because they were doing that. But then there was this one study that basically said something along the lines that high school students who don't have technology have to take an extra technology class in college. And while that's kind of related, because it is related to high school students and computer science and technology, it wasn't really relevant to this particular project, because this project was all about pedagogy in the high school. So it really didn't matter that there was this extra article in there about the fact that these students would have to take this class in college, unless you could make the leap to just say, well, if we don't do it, they might have to take this extra class. Like there is a tangent there. But what we ultimately decided is that there's only so much room. That really didn't go in any of the categories that she was thematically organizing her literature, which we'll come back to in a second. And so she just made the decision then not to use it. So sometimes this is a hard question, but I think a worthwhile task. And particularly if you're really burned out on writing and you're like, I cannot write another word, I got to do something else. I would argue spending time going through your literature review, any draft that you have of it, any couple paragraphs, any chapter, and just going source by source and just quickly deciding, yes, it has to be in there. If so, give it a green highlight. And then if you're not sure, or you're really thinking like, I think maybe I'm not sure, ask yourself some questions about it. How is it related to the topic of your study? Is it offering background information? Sometimes there's a thing is too much background information, and you only need maybe 2 or 3 sources to establish background versus the 12 that you already have. And in that case, you might be able to pick the best ones. Other things that you might think through, and I threw some of these questions up here, would be to think about how you're going to use this literature in a way that you're not just summarizing, but you're actually having a critical discussion. And so this website, and I'm going to roll up to where that was, offers a really helpful framework for deciding, are you just summarizing or are you synthesizing? So this is another way to make a decision about if your literature is connecting to your project. Because, for example, if you're only summarizing, you're putting in a source, you're talking about that a source, but the source itself does not support your argument or refute your argument. So it's just in there. That doesn't really do anything to give you a critical discussion, and that's where synthesis comes in. So another thing that would be helpful here to think through is that if you go through and you look at a little discussion about one of your sources where you're describing what a study does, a summary would be reporting the ideas from that study, but synthesis would be highlighting some important points and some observations about the related texts. So in other ways that you have to think through working on the literature review and deciding what to include would be, what's the important takeaway from this study and how does it relate to my particular project? If you can't do those 2 steps, then usually that's not a great source that's supporting your project in any way. Another thing to think through when we're trying to decide if literature connects to your project would be to decide what is the organization of the literature itself. And I know we've talked about this in a past episode on lit reviews. I'll make sure that I link to our previous episodes on this. And for the record, I should say, we also did a whole series on literature reviews last year. If you're interested in getting that series on how to write your literature review, please contact me at Christine@defendandpublish.com. We do sell that recording for people that are interested in getting it. So if you want it, just drop me an email and I'll make sure I give you the information about how to access it. But essentially, you could think through how you want to organize your literature. And even in a short article where maybe your literature review is 5 paragraphs or something like that, some organization is usually required. So some of the frameworks that are offered on the website that I mentioned is very helpful. You might think, of course, chronologically, which is sometimes thinking about a historic tracing of a topic or a problem. You could have something organized by dates. You could talk about concepts. So history doesn't have to be totally by dates. It could be about concepts as they've emerged and how they've evolved over time. You could also think about themes. This is one way that I work with graduate students now in organizing a literature review, because they usually don't have enough background yet to know a chronology or a history, but they certainly can read the sources and decide relevant themes for their project. So relevant themes for everyone's project are probably along the line, some of them, certainly there's more than these, but some relevant ones for everybody's project would be things like, establishment of the problem. Maybe some of that literature will go in your introduction, but maybe you need something to set up that the challenge that you're studying is actually a challenge. Another theme you might use is something like, previous research conducted on the topic. That could be another theme. Maybe another theme that you have is more on topic. So, for example, one project I just did where I was connecting faculty writing productivity, graduate school training, and then personal habits. I've just connected those three things. Those were really three different bodies of literature that I had to organize. So I did even say when I organized my literature review that I'm drawing from three different bodies of literature. And then those were the three headings I gave. So thematic sometimes can help when you know you've got to do a couple of different things. You've got to establish a problem. You've got to talk about why your topic is relevant. You've got to talk about why there's a gap in the research. We're always trying to do that with literature to show why our study is needed. Also, the methods, you could also do a methodological look at literature. So maybe the way that a certain issue has been studied has changed over time. And so now you're arguing for a new methodology in your project. All of this is explained more on the website, but it basically is giving you, if we return to looking at your own writing for your literature review, I mentioned going through and highlighting everything in green, 100% has to be in here. You could also figure out some things that don't need to be in anymore, or at least you don't know where to put them by deciding on a structure of how you're going to organize this. So maybe one of the things that you found is maybe you've got 4 themes for your literature review and you've got this one source that's sort of related but doesn't really go with a theme. One thing that I argue with my clients and my students is to cross out that source. So just cross it out, but don't take it out. So use the strike through option on the keyboard because you don't know in any future version of the draft if you're going to use it. But at least for right now, you're kind of saying, I think I don't need this. And then that leaves the stuff in the middle. So some of those sources you might need, but you might also have to rank them and decide, all right, what's not green, what's not used with the strike through, what do I do with this middle content that I don't know if I need it or not? You could go then source by source and rank them and decide this source is better than this other one at talking about this issue. And one of the things that we see definitely with dissertation clients is that they tend to find sources that do the same thing. They'll find 7 sources that are all doing the same purpose in the literature review, like 7 sources that are all establishing the problem, when maybe 2 or 3 would do because they're establishing it from different angles. So as I close out this episode, I just wanted to point out a couple other things that are on this website that I think are really helpful. So certainly there's some organization strategies on here that I think are helpful. It also reminds you of some of the goals of a literature review. But there's also some links in here to a synthesis matrix for a literature review that I think would be a really helpful downloadable template. So if you're just getting started on a literature review, even for a new project, if you've been writing for a long time and you've never really thought about how to organize the literature review section, this might be a tool to try. So I'm working on a new project right now, and when I looked at the synthesis matrix again, I realized I've never used something like this to write my literature review sections of articles, and so I am planning to use it now and figure out how I'm going to organize this one article that I'm working on. So hopefully these tips are helpful to you, and we encourage you, if you haven't yet, checked out our new website that came out last week at Defend, Publish, and Lead. You can check it out. It's up and we're looking for feedback. So thanks for checking it and happy writing this week.